Welcome to Wild West Stories, where forgotten tales of courage, love, and redemption come alive. I'm your storyteller, and today we're traveling back to 1883 to a small frontier town called Cedar Ridge, where society's rules about women and marriage were as rigid as iron bars. But this is the story of Margaret Wilson, a 45-year-old woman who refused to let those rules define her worth. It's about the day her dreams were shattered in front of an entire town, and how a mysterious cowboy turned her greatest humiliation into her most beautiful beginning. So settle in, grab your coffee, and prepare for a tale that proves love doesn't have an expiration date. And sometimes the best things in life come to those who've learned to wait with dignity. Let's begin. Margaret Wilson stood frozen on the church steps, the preacher's words echoing like gunshots. I cannot marry a woman past her childbearing years. At 45, she had been called many things: spinster, burden, leftover woman. But as the townspeople whispered and pointed, a weathered cowboy named Cole stepped forward. Then marry her to me, he said simply. I see exactly what she's worth. But let me take you back to the beginning of this day, when hope still lived in Margaret's heart like a candle flickering against the wind. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, but Margaret Wilson felt nothing but cold. She stood before the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, her hands trembling as she adjusted the collar of her only good dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, much like herself. At 45, she had learned to make peace with reflections that showed more years than dreams fulfilled, more wisdom than the world seemed to value in a woman. The boarding house room was small and sparse, containing only the basic necessities: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single wooden chair that wobbled when she sat in it. The wallpaper, once probably cheerful with tiny roses, had faded to a dull pink that matched Margaret's diminished expectations of life. But today was supposed to be different. Today she was supposed to marry Edgar Thornton, a widower who'd answered her carefully worded advertisement in the matrimonial section of the Cedar Ridge Gazette. The advertisement had taken her weeks to compose, each word chosen with the precision of a lawyer drafting a contract. Respectable woman, 45, seeks companionship in marriage with gentlemen of good character. Excellent cook, skilled with needle and thread, experienced in household management. No longer of childbearing age but possess youthful spirit and strong constitution. Correspondence welcomed. She'd held her breath for 3 weeks after placing the ad, checking the post office daily with a mixture of hope and dread. When Edgar's first letter arrived, written in careful script on quality paper, Margaret had read it so many times she'd memorized every word. Dear Miss Wilson, your advertisement intrigued me. I am a widower of 52, owner of a modest dry goods store in Cedar Ridge. I seek a wife for companionship and household management. Your honesty regarding your age is refreshing. I believe practical marriages often prove more satisfactory than those based solely on passion. Would you be amenable to correspondence? It wasn't romantic, but it was respectful, it was honest, and most importantly, it acknowledged her age without dismissing her because of it. Margaret had spent her life savings on paper and ink for their correspondence, pouring her hopes onto pages that traveled back and forth between Cedar Ridge and the larger town of Millbrook, where she'd been working as a seamstress. Edgar had seemed genuine in his letters. He'd written about his late wife with appropriate reverence, described his modest but comfortable life, and expressed what appeared to be sincere interest in Margaret's thoughts on everything from literature to politics. When he'd finally proposed marriage through correspondence and suggested she come to Cedar Ridge for the ceremony, Margaret had dared to believe that her long wait was finally over. She'd spent her meager savings on a new hat, a practical brown felt with a single feather that she thought made her look younger. She'd had her hair properly styled for the first time in years, the auburn strands now showing more silver than red, but still thick and healthy. She'd even purchased a thin gold band to symbolize her commitment to making this marriage work. Though Edgar had mentioned he would provide rings for the ceremony, as she made her final preparations, Margaret caught herself humming, something she hadn't done in years. Mrs. Fletcher, the boarding housekeeper, had knocked on her door earlier to wish her well. I hope you'll be very happy, dear, Mrs. Fletcher had said, her weathered face creased with genuine warmth. "You deserve some joy in your life." Margaret had thanked her, but privately she thought that deserving and receiving were two very different things. She'd learned not to expect joy, only to hope for contentment and security. The church bells chimed 9 o'clock as she stepped onto Main Street, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Cedar Ridge was larger than Millbrook, with wooden sidewalks, gas street lamps, and buildings that rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories into the morning sky. The street bustled with activity even at this early hour. Shopkeepers opening their stores, children running errands for their mothers, men heading to work at the lumber mill or the railroad depot. But as Margaret walked toward the church, she noticed how conversation seemed to pause as she passed. Townspeople lined the boardwalks, their eyes following her progress with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for accidents or public spectacles. Margaret had learned over her 45 years to recognize when she was the subject of gossip, and the familiar burn of scrutiny crept up her neck. "Is that her?" she heard a woman whisper to her companion. "Must be. Poor thing. At her age. Edgar Thornton's marrying her. Well, I suppose even he can't be too particular at his age." Margaret lifted her chin higher and kept walking, her spine straight as a steel rod. She'd endured worse whispers in smaller towns. At least these people didn't know her history, didn't know about the broken engagement when she was 23, her fiancé had found a younger woman with a larger dowry, or the years she'd spent caring for her dying mother, while other women her age were building families. The Cedar Ridge Community Church was a modest wooden structure with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that caught the morning light like jewels. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, more people than Margaret had expected for a simple wedding ceremony between two middle-aged strangers. She recognized none of them, but their faces held the same expression she'd seen in every town she'd ever lived in. Pity mixed with a kind of fascination at watching someone else's private business become public entertainment. Edgar Thornton waited near the church door with Reverend Hayes, a portly man with kind eyes and a reputation for performing ceremonies with appropriate dignity. Edgar was exactly as he described himself in his letters, a thin man of medium height with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a good black suit that was perhaps a bit too large for his frame, and he clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers that Margaret assumed was meant for her. But something was wrong. She could see it in his posture before she was close enough to read his expression. Edgar stood rigid, his shoulders hunched as if bracing against a strong wind. His eyes darted nervously between the assembled crowd and Margaret's approaching figure, and he seemed to be having an intense, whispered conversation with the Reverend. "Edgar," Margaret said softly as she reached the church steps, offering him her warmest smile. "You look well. Are those flowers for me?" Edgar jumped as if she'd startled him from deep thought. "Margaret." "Yes. Well." He glanced at the bouquet in his hands as if he'd forgotten he was holding it, then looked back at her with an expression that made her stomach clench with sudden dread. "About that. About today. About these flowers, actually. About everything." The words hit her before he even spoke them clearly. She could see it in his posture, in the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed repeatedly, in the nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a forge. But still, some stubborn part of her refused to accept what was coming. "Edgar?" she prompted gently. "Is something wrong?" He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being shifted. "I've been thinking, Margaret, all night actually, about this arrangement, about what we discussed in our letters, about the nature of marriage and its purposes, and—" Margaret's voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to tremble. "And I've reconsidered," Edgar said, the words tumbling out in a rush as if he wanted to rid himself of them as quickly as possible. "This arrangement, it won't work. I'm sorry, but I cannot go through with it." The gathered crowd had grown silent, sensing drama in the air like animals sensing a coming storm. Margaret felt every eye upon her, felt the weight of their curiosity and judgment pressing down like a physical force. "I see," she said quietly. "May I ask what changed your mind?" Edgar's face flushed red from his collar to his hairline. "It's just, Well, you're, that is to say, he gestured vaguely in her direction, his movements awkward and desperate. You're not what I expected. And what did you expect? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to understand. The same understanding had dawned on her many times before, in many different circumstances, with many different men who'd seemed interested until they'd actually seen her. Someone younger, Edgar blurted out, the admission seeming to give him courage to continue. Someone who could still, well, give me children, start a family properly, build something for the future. The whispers around them grew louder, no longer attempts at discretion but open commentary on the unfolding drama. Well, I declare, Margaret heard Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, saying to her companion, the poor dear should have known better at her age. Someone should have warned her years ago, another woman's voice added. There's a time for everything, and hers has clearly passed. 45 years old and still chasing after husbands like a schoolgirl, came a third voice, followed by nervous laughter. Margaret felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up her neck, but this time it was worse than ever before. This wasn't just private rejection. This was public judgment, delivered in front of an audience that had come expecting to witness a wedding and instead found themselves watching her dreams crumble in real time. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Edgar interrupted, his voice gaining strength now that his decision was made. He drew himself up to his full height, which brought him barely to Margaret's shoulder. There's nothing to discuss privately. The simple truth is that I cannot marry a woman past her childbearing years. It wouldn't be practical. It wouldn't be suitable. He handed the bouquet not to Margaret, but to Reverend Hayes as if returning merchandise to a shopkeeper. I'm sorry for any inconvenience, but surely you understand. A man has certain expectations from marriage, certain needs that must be met. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Margaret felt something breaking inside her chest, something that had already been cracked and patched so many times that this final blow might shatter it completely. But instead of crumbling, instead of fleeing in tears as everyone seemed to expect, Margaret Wilson drew herself up to her full height and looked Edgar Thornton directly in the eyes. I understand perfectly, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the church steps despite its quietness. You want a broodmare, not a wife. You want someone whose value is measured solely by her ability to produce children, regardless of her character, intelligence, or capacity for companionship. Edgar's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly unprepared for this response. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You corresponded with me for months, Edgar. You know my mind, my thoughts, my capabilities. You know I'm educated, responsible, and capable of managing a household. But none of that matters to you because I cannot give you something that many younger women cannot give you either, a guarantee of children. The crowd was completely silent now, riveted by this unexpected turn in the drama. You're right about one thing, Margaret said, taking a step closer to Edgar, who actually backed away from her. This marriage wouldn't work, not because of my age, but because you lack the wisdom to recognize what real value looks like in a partner. She turned to address the crowd directly, her voice ringing with a dignity that surprised even her. And as for the rest of you, thank you for the reminder that a woman's worth is apparently measured only by her womb and not by her heart, her mind, or her soul. Mrs. Abernathy's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Well, I never. The poor dear should have accepted her lot years ago instead of making a spectacle of herself. Someone should have told her that there's a time for marriage, and hers passed long ago, another woman added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. 45 years old and still trying to catch a husband, came a third voice. Some women just don't know when to accept that they're meant to be alone. Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to remind her of her place in the world's hierarchy. She was too old, too late, too hopeful for her own good. She was a cautionary tale, a reminder to other women about the dangers of waiting too long or wanting too much. She turned to leave, to walk back down those church steps with whatever dignity she could muster, when a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like thunder breaking through a storm. Then marry her to me. Every head turned toward the source of the voice as if pulled by invisible strings. The crowd parted like water, revealing a man who stepped forward from the very back of the gathering. He was tall, taller than any man Margaret had ever seen, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His clothes were simple but well-maintained. Dark denim pants that had seen honest work, a white cotton shirt open at the collar, and a black hat that had weathered many storms. But it wasn't his clothes or even his impressive height that commanded attention. It was the way he moved, with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of facing down challenges and emerging victorious. There was something about him that made the crowd instinctively step back, creating a clear path as he approached the church steps. Margaret had never seen him before in her life, but she felt in strange certainty that he was exactly what he appeared to be. A cowboy, probably a drifter, certainly someone with no business involving himself in her humiliation. Yet here he was, walking toward her with purpose written in every line of his body. "Excuse me," Edgar sputtered, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "Who are you? What gives you the right to interfere in this matter?" The stranger reached the bottom of the church steps and paused, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and mildly mocking. "Cole Brennan," he said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, "and you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life, friend." Edgar's face went from red to purple. "I beg your pardon? This is a private matter between Miss Wilson and myself." "Was a private matter," Cole corrected, his gaze moving from Edgar to Margaret. "Now it's a public humiliation, and I don't much care for the way you're conducting yourself." Margaret found herself staring at this stranger, this Cole Brennan, trying to understand what was happening. His eyes, she noticed, were a warm brown, the color of rich coffee or fertile soil. They were direct and honest, completely without the pity or condescension she'd grown so accustomed to seeing in other people's faces. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you? What do you want?" Cole looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret felt as if he was seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way that no one had for years, not as a desperate spinster or a cautionary tale, but as a woman worthy of consideration. "I want," Cole said carefully, "to prevent a good woman from being treated poorly by someone who doesn't deserve her." Edgar laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "A good woman? She's 45 years old. She's past her prime, past her usefulness." "Careful," Cole interrupted, and though his voice remained calm, there was something in it that made Edgar take an involuntary step backward. "You're talking about a lady." "I'm talking about reality," Edgar insisted, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Marriage is a practical arrangement. A woman of her age cannot fulfill the basic purposes of matrimony." Cole stepped closer to Margaret, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes. "And what?" Cole asked mildly. "Do you consider the basic purposes of matrimony?" Edgar straightened his shoulders, clearly believing he was on solid ground. "Companionship, yes, but also the continuation of family lines. Children. A man needs sons to carry on his name, to help with his business." "Then you should have specified that in your advertisement," Cole said, "instead of leading a woman to believe you were interested in her as a person." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever defended her before. Not like this. Not with such quiet conviction and obvious respect. "Sir," Reverend Hayes interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was developing, "I don't think you understand the complexities of this situation." "I understand perfectly," Cole said, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "A good woman is being told she's not worthy of love because of the number of years she's lived. A fool is throwing away the best thing that's ever going to walk into his life. And a crowd of people who should know better are treating someone's private pain like entertainment." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some people beginning to drift away as the spectacle took on a more serious tone. Cole continued, his voice growing stronger. "I understand that this woman has more courage in her little finger than most men have in their entire bodies because she's standing here facing down public humiliation with grace and dignity." He paused, then added quietly, and I understand that if you don't want her, there are men who would be honored to call her wife." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of humiliation anymore. They were tears of something she'd almost given up believing existed: recognition, validation, respect. "Are you—" she began, then stopped, afraid to voice the question. "Am I what?" Cole asked gently. "Are you saying you would marry me?" The words came out as barely a whisper. Cole's expression softened, and for a moment it was as if the crowd around them had disappeared entirely. "Ma'am, I'm saying that any man who could spend months corresponding with you and then reject you for something as meaningless as age is a fool who doesn't deserve you." Edgar made a sound of outrage. "Meaningless? Age is hardly meaningless when it comes to marriage." "You're right," Cole said, turning back to face Edgar. "Age isn't meaningless. It means she's had time to develop wisdom, character, and strength. It means she knows her own mind and won't change it on a whim. It means she survived whatever life has thrown at her and emerged with grace intact." He gestured toward Margaret. "This woman has been tested by life and proven herself worthy. She's honest enough to state her age plainly instead of lying about it. She's brave enough to travel to a strange town to marry a man she's never met. She's dignified enough to face rejection without crumbling." Cole's voice grew stronger, carrying clearly across the church steps. "Those aren't liabilities, friend. Those are assets. And if you're too blind to see them, then you don't deserve her." Margaret felt something shifting inside her chest, something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. It was hope, but not the desperate, clinging hope she carried to Cedar Ridge. This was something different, a quiet certainty that she had value, that she was worthy of respect, that she deserved better than Edgar Thornton's casual cruelty. "I don't even know you," she said to Cole, testing the words, testing the feeling they created. Cole smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face completely. "Then we'll have plenty to learn about each other. What do you say, Miss Wilson? Would you be willing to give an honest man a chance to show you what real appreciation looks like?" Margaret looked around at the crowd, at Edgar's flabbergasted expression, at Mrs. Abernathy's shocked face. These people had spent the morning telling her she was too old, too late, too hopeful for her own good. They'd made her humiliation into their entertainment, her pain into their gossip. She looked back at Cole, at this man who'd appeared from nowhere to defend her worth when no one else would. She studied his face, searching for signs of mockery or pity, or the kind of desperation that might drive a man to marry anyone just to have a wife. She found none of those things. Instead, she saw something she'd almost given up believing existed: genuine respect, honest appreciation, and what might have been the beginning of real affection. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd exploded in shocked exclamations, voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief, scandal, and judgment. But Margaret heard none of it clearly. The world had narrowed to Cole Brennan's warm brown eyes and his quiet "thank you," and the feeling of his hand, rough and calloused from honest work, closing gently over hers. "But you can't," Edgar protested, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "You don't know each other. This is madness. More madness than corresponding for months and then rejecting someone based on appearance," Cole asked mildly. Reverend Hayes looked between them with the expression of a man who'd found himself in the middle of a situation far beyond his experience. That is, there are procedures. Bans must be published. Documentation must be—" "Reverend," Cole said patiently, "is there any legal reason Miss Wilson and I cannot be married right here and now?" The Reverend consulted his mental catalog of marriage law. "Well, no, not if you're both of age and unmarried, but it's highly irregular." "Irregular isn't illegal," Cole pointed out, "and I'd say the circumstances are already irregular enough that a little more won't matter." Margaret found her voice. "Reverend Hayes, I understand this is unusual, but I've already made arrangements for a wedding today. I have my dress, I have witnesses, and I have a groom who actually wants to marry me. The only thing that's changed is the name of the man I'm marrying." Mrs. Abernathy pushed forward through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. This is scandalous. You can't just marry any stranger who wanders up. Why not? Margaret asked, turning to face her. I was prepared to marry Edgar, and until this morning he was essentially a stranger. I'd never seen him, never spoken to him face to face. At least Mr. Brennan has shown me more respect in 5 minutes than Edgar managed in months of correspondence. But he could be anyone, another woman called out. A criminal, a drifter. Could be, Cole agreed easily. Just like your banker could be embezzling money, or your mayor could be taking bribes, or your preacher could be skimming from the collection plate. People aren't always what they seem, ma'am, but sometimes they're exactly what they appear to be. He turned to Margaret. I'm a rancher, Miss Wilson. I own a small spread about 5 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable and paid for. I've got cattle, horses, and enough savings to weather a bad season or two. I don't drink to excess, I don't gamble, and I've never raised a hand to a woman or child. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been relief. And why would you want to marry someone you've never met? Cole was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with the same care he might use to evaluate a horse or judge the weather. Because, he said finally, I've been alone for most of my adult life, and I'm tired of it. Because I've watched too many good people settle for less than they deserve because they're afraid to take a chance. And because in the space of 5 minutes, you've shown me more courage and dignity than most people manage in a lifetime. The crowd had grown quieter, some people drifting away as they realized the spectacle was turning into something more serious than entertainment. But others pressed closer, drawn by the unexpected drama unfolding on the church steps. Edgar made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Margaret, be reasonable. You know nothing about this man. At least with me, you knew what to expect. I knew what to expect, Margaret agreed. A marriage based on convenience and low expectations. A husband who would tolerate me rather than appreciate me. A life spent being grateful for scraps of affection and constantly proving my worth. She looked at Cole, then back at Edgar. Mr. Brennan is offering me something you never did. Respect. He's asking me to take a chance on something better rather than settle for something merely adequate. This is madness, Edgar repeated, but his voice had lost its conviction. Maybe, Margaret said, but it's my madness to choose. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat. If you're both certain about this course of action, I suppose, that is, if you're prepared to exchange vows. I am, Cole said simply. Margaret looked at him, this stranger who'd stepped out of nowhere to offer her a different future. She thought about all the years she'd waited, all the compromises she'd been prepared to make, all the times she'd been told to lower her expectations and be grateful for whatever she could get. So am I, she said. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined for herself. As a girl, she'd dreamed of white lace and orange blossoms, of a church filled with friends and family, of a man who looked at her with adoration. Reality was a simple blue dress, wildflowers that Edgar had brought for her, but that Reverend Hayes now handed to Cole, and a groom who looked at her with something that might have been respect but was still too new to be called love. But as Cole took her hand and spoke his vows in a voice steady and sure, Margaret felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt chosen, not settled for, not tolerated, not accepted despite her flaws, but chosen deliberately and completely. Do you, Margaret Wilson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Margaret looked into Cole's brown eyes and saw her future reflected there. Uncertain perhaps, but full of possibility. I do. Do you, Cole Brennan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Cole said, and Margaret heard something in his voice that made her believe he meant it completely. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Cole leaned forward and kissed her gently on the forehead, a gesture so tender and respectful that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Mrs. Brennan, he said softly, testing the name. Mrs. Brennan, she repeated, and the name felt like a gift. As they turned to face the crowd, Margaret saw a mixture of expressions: shock, disapproval, curiosity, and on a few faces, something that might have been approval. Mrs. Fletcher, her boarding house keeper, had arrived late and was beaming at her with genuine joy. A few of the younger women in the crowd looked thoughtful, as if witnessing something that challenged their assumptions about love and marriage. But Edgar's face was a study in outraged disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he announced to anyone who would listen. "She'll regret this within a week. Mark my words, she'll come crawling back when she realizes what kind of man she's actually married." Cole paused in helping Margaret down the church steps. "Edgar," he said conversationally, "I'd suggest you stop talking now. You've already made enough of a fool of yourself for one day. You can't just steal another man's bride." "I didn't steal anything," Cole replied calmly. "You threw her away. I just had sense enough to pick her up." As they walked away from the church, Margaret felt the strange sensation of her life splitting into before and after. Before, when she'd been Margaret Wilson, the spinster, the burden, the woman who'd waited too long and hoped too much. And after, when she'd become Margaret Brennan, the woman worth fighting for. "Cole," she said as they reached the main street where a simple wagon waited. "Yes? Why did you really do that? Why did you marry a woman you don't even know?" He was quiet for a moment, helping her up onto the wagon seat before answering. "My mother died when I was 12, he said finally, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "People said she was too old when she married my father. She was 38 and he was 25. They said she was past her time, that she'd never be able to give him children or make him happy." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to this story. "They were wrong about everything," Cole continued, guiding the horses away from town. "She gave him me and my sister. But more than that, she gave him 20 years of the kind of love most men only dream about. She was the strongest, wisest, most beautiful woman I ever knew." He glanced at Margaret. "When I saw that fool throwing away his chance with you, when I heard those people talking about you like you were some kind of burden instead of a prize, I saw him throwing away what my father almost lost because he listened to other people's opinions about what makes a woman valuable." "And you think I'm like your mother?" Cole considered this carefully. "I think you're a woman who's been undervalued for far too long. I think you've got more strength and grace than any of those people back there deserve to witness. And I think that if you'll give me a chance, I might just be lucky enough to discover all the ways I was right." As they drove through the countryside toward Cole's ranch, Margaret found herself studying her new husband's profile. He had strong features weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, and he sat with the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Are you worried?" he asked, apparently noticing her scrutiny. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I've never been married. I don't know how to be a wife to someone like you." "Someone like me?" "Someone kind," she said softly. "Someone who sees good in me when other people see only problems. I'm not used to that." Cole pulled the wagon to a stop beside a creek that ran clear and cold between stands of cottonwood trees. "Margaret," he said, turning to face her fully, "I need you to understand something important." He took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "I didn't marry you out of pity or charity or some misguided sense of chivalry. I married you because in the space of 5 minutes, you showed me more courage and dignity than most people manage in a lifetime." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles. "You stood there and took that man's cruelty with grace. You were prepared to walk away with your head high even when everyone was watching and judging. You defended yourself with intelligence and strength instead of dissolving into tears or anger." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "That's not someone who needs to be rescued," Cole continued. "That's someone worth knowing, worth respecting, worth learning to love if you'll let me try." The word love hung in the air between them, carrying weight and promise and terrifying possibility. "I don't know how to let someone try," Margaret whispered. "Then we'll figure it out together," Cole said simply. "Day by day, mistake by mistake, until we get it right." The Brennan Ranch sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with cattle and horses. Margaret's first glimpse of it took her breath away, not because it was grand or luxurious, but because it looked like home. The house was modest but well-maintained, built of sturdy timber with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Windows caught the afternoon light like welcoming eyes, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line against the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and meant it completely. "It'll do," Cole replied, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "My father built the original cabin, and I've added to it over the years. Nothing fancy, but it's solid and comfortable." He helped her down from the wagon, and Margaret stood for a moment, taking in her new surroundings. The yard was neat and practical, with a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending, a chicken coop where birds scratched contentedly in the dirt, and a barn that looked well-maintained despite its obvious age. "Come on," Cole said, gathering her single trunk and carpet bag. "I'll show you around." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. Two bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper cook stove, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and furniture that was obviously handmade but well-crafted. Everything was clean and orderly, the home of a man who took care of what he had. "The larger bedroom is yours," Cole said, setting her trunk down near the doorway. "I'll take the smaller room. I figured we should take things slow, get to know each other properly well, before we become husband and wife in every sense." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been disappointment mixed with relief. "That's very considerate of you." "It's practical," Cole said. "We're strangers who made a big decision very quickly. We should probably make sure we can stand each other's company before we complicate things further." As the days passed, Margaret discovered that Cole Brennan was a man of his word in every respect. He was patient with her uncertainties, respectful of her space, and utterly consistent in treating her with a consideration she'd never experienced before. Each morning, he rose before dawn to tend the animals and check the fences, returning to the house as Margaret was preparing breakfast. They would eat together in companionable silence. Cole reading the newspaper he picked up in town twice a week, Margaret planning the day's household tasks. "You don't have to cook for me," he'd said on their second morning together. "I've been managing my own meals for years." "I know," Margaret had replied, "but I like to cook, and you seem to appreciate good food." It was true. Cole ate her simple meals with the enthusiasm of a man who'd grown tired of his own limited culinary skills. He complimented her biscuits, praised her stew, and went back for seconds of everything she prepared. The household tasks fell naturally into a rhythm that surprised them both. Margaret took over the cooking, cleaning, and mending, while Cole handled the outdoor work. But the division wasn't rigid. She often helped with easier ranch chores, and he never hesitated to assist with heavy lifting or repairs around the house. "You're handy with that hammer," Cole observed one afternoon, watching Margaret repair a loose board on the front porch. "My father was a carpenter," Margaret explained, positioning another nail with practiced precision. "He taught me that it was foolish to wait for someone else to fix what you could repair yourself." "Smart man. What happened to him?" "Died when I was 23. That's when I started working as a seamstress." Margaret drove the nail home with three sure strokes. "Mother lived another 15 years, but she was difficult. Bitter about how her life had turned out. Angry at the world for not giving her what she felt she deserved." Cole leaned against the porch railing, watching her work. "That why you never married young?" Margaret set down the hammer and looked at him directly. "Partly. I was engaged once when I was 23. Nice enough man, owned a small farm outside town. But when my father died and left debts, when it became clear I'd need to work to support my mother, well, he decided he needed a wife who could devote herself entirely to his needs." "Fool," Cole said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe just practical, like Edgar." Margaret tested the repaired board with her weight. "I told myself it was better to know his priorities before the wedding rather than after." Their conversations often took this form, casual exchanges that revealed pieces of their histories, their thoughts, their gradual understanding of each other. Margaret learned that Cole had been married briefly in his 20s, a young love that had ended when his wife died in childbirth, along with their son. "I blame myself for a long time," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Thought maybe if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd done something different." "How long were you married?" Margaret asked gently. 2 years. She was 19 when we wed, barely 21 when she died. Sweet girl, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. She was young. Everything was excitement or tragedy, joy or devastation. There was no middle ground, no peace. Margaret nodded, understanding more than he'd actually said. And that's what you want now? Peace? I want a partner, Cole said simply. Someone to share the work and the quiet moments and the conversations that matter. Someone who'll stand beside me when things get hard and celebrate with me when they go well. Not passion? Margaret asked, surprised by her own boldness. Cole looked at her thoughtfully. Passion burns hot and fast. What I'm looking for burns steady and long. Passion is what young people think love is. What we might build together, that's what love actually looks like. As weeks turned into months, Margaret began to understand what he meant. Their relationship wasn't built on overwhelming attraction or dramatic declarations. Instead, it grew through shared meals and quiet conversations, through the countless small kindnesses they showed each other, through the gradual realization that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Margaret had never experienced anything like it. The few romantic relationships of her youth had been based on anxiety and hope. Anxiety about whether the man truly cared for her, hope that she could make herself indispensable enough to keep him. With Cole, there was none of that desperate uncertainty. He showed his regard through consistent action rather than flowery words, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the security of being valued rather than merely tolerated. The town's reaction to their marriage had initially been one of scandalized fascination, but as time passed and it became clear that the Brennan household was thriving, opinions began to shift. Margaret's competent management of the ranch's domestic affairs earned grudging respect, and Cole's obvious contentment with his choice became harder to dismiss as temporary infatuation. I have to admit, Mrs. Fletcher said during one of Margaret's weekly trips to town, you're looking better than I've seen you in years. Marriage agrees with you. It was true. Margaret had gained weight in the months since her wedding, her clothes fitting more snugly in a way that suggested regular, nutritious meals, rather than the sparse diet she'd maintained as a working seamstress. Her skin had lost the pale, drawn look of chronic worry, and there was a confidence in her bearing that hadn't been there before. Cole is a good husband, Margaret replied simply. And you're a good wife to him, Mrs. Fletcher said. I heard he brought the finest beef to market this season, and Sarah McCready said your garden produced more vegetables than any other in the county. Margaret felt a warm glow of pride. She had thrown herself into making Cole's ranch as successful as possible, applying the same careful attention to household management that she'd once devoted to her needlework. The results were visible in everything, from the excellent condition of the farmhouse to the thriving garden that now supplied not only their table, but provided surplus for sale in town. But it wasn't just practical success that marked their marriage. Margaret was discovering aspects of herself that had been buried under years of uncertainty and self-doubt. With Cole's encouragement, she'd begun reading again, not just practical books about housekeeping and farming, but novels and poetry that fed her mind and spirit. You're educated, Cole had observed one evening, finding her absorbed in a volume of Tennyson. Somewhat. My father believed girls should learn to read and cipher as well as boys. Said an ignorant woman made for a boring wife and a poor mother. He was right. I like listening to you talk about what you're reading. Makes me think about things differently. These conversations became one of Margaret's favorite parts of their routine. Cole was intelligent and thoughtful, and he genuinely valued her opinions on everything from literature to politics to the practical management of their shared life. The physical aspect of their marriage had developed slowly and naturally. After 3 months of sleeping in separate rooms, sharing meals and conversations and daily tasks, they'd begun to feel like genuine partners rather than polite strangers. When Cole had finally asked if she'd like to share his bed, the question had felt like a natural progression rather than an awkward transition. Their intimacy was tender rather than passionate, built on respect and growing affection rather than overwhelming desire. For Margaret, who had never experienced physical love before, it was a revelation to discover that gentleness could be as moving as passion, that being cherished could be more thrilling than being desired. Are you happy? Cole asked her one morning as they worked together in the garden, Margaret harvesting tomatoes while he repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by deer. Margaret paused in her work, considering the question seriously. Happiness had never seemed like a realistic goal for someone like her. She'd aimed for security, contentment, the absence of active misery. But this feeling of usefulness, of being valued, of building something meaningful with another person, yes, this was happiness. Yes, she said, surprised by how easily the word came. I am happy. Are you? Cole looked around at the thriving ranch, at the woman who'd helped make it more successful than it had ever been, at the life they'd built together through patience and mutual respect. Yes, he said, I am. It was a simple exchange, but it marked something important. The recognition that their marriage had become not just a practical arrangement, but a source of genuine joy for both of them. But life, as Margaret had learned through 45 years of experience, rarely allowed happiness to exist unchallenged. The first test of their marriage came on a crisp October morning when Edgar Thornton appeared at their door. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard the sound of a horse's hooves in the yard. Through the window, she saw a familiar figure dismounting near the porch, and her stomach clenched with immediate dread. Cole, she called, trying to keep her voice steady. We have a visitor. Cole emerged from the barn where he'd been mending harness, took one look at their unexpected guest, and his expression hardened. What do you want, Thornton? Edgar had changed in the months since the wedding. He looked thinner, somewhat shabbier, with the defeated air of a man whose plans had gone badly awry. I came to talk to Margaret, he said, not quite meeting Cole's eyes. Mrs. Brennan, Cole corrected quietly, and you can say whatever you need to say in front of both of us. Margaret stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt Cole move to stand beside her, not protectively but supportively, and drew strength from his steady presence. Hello, Edgar, she said calmly. What brings you out this way? Edgar's eyes darted between them, taking in Margaret's obviously improved appearance, Cole's relaxed confidence, the clear signs of a household that was thriving. I came to, that is, I wanted to speak with you about what happened. What about it? Margaret asked. I think I may have been hasty, Edgar said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. In my decision about our arrangement, Cole made a sound that might have been amusement. Hasty, that's one word for it. Edgar flushed. I've had time to reconsider, to think about what I really need in a wife. Companionship, household management, someone mature and reliable. And you've decided I might be suitable for those purposes after all? Margaret asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Yes, that is, I believe we might suit each other very well if we approach marriage as the practical arrangement it should be. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees by the creek. Edgar, she said finally, are you asking me to leave my husband and marry you instead? Edgar straightened his shoulders, apparently taking her question as encouragement. I'm offering you a second chance, a chance to make the kind of marriage you originally wanted. Stable, respectable, with a man who understands your value. My value, Margaret repeated slowly. Yes, I realize now that I was wrong to focus on certain aspects of marriage. A woman of your age and experience would make an excellent companion. You wouldn't have unrealistic expectations about romance or passion. You'd understand that marriage is a partnership based on mutual benefit. Margaret felt Cole tense beside her, but when she glanced at him, he gave her a slight nod that said, handle this however you need to. I see, she said, turning back to Edgar. And what happened to change your mind? Last I heard, you were looking for a young bride who could give you children. Edgar's face darkened. That didn't work out as planned. Oh, the girl I married turned out to be unsuitable, flighty, expensive. She had ridiculous ideas about love and romance, wanted constant attention and gifts we couldn't afford. Then she ran off with a traveling salesman, took half my savings and my best horse. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. So now you've decided that what you really want is a mature woman who won't expect affection or attention or any of those expensive romantic gestures. Exactly, Edgar said, apparently missing the ice in her voice. You understand the practical nature of marriage. You wouldn't make unreasonable demands. Edgar, Margaret said, her voice perfectly calm, I want you to look around this ranch. Look at this house, this yard, these thriving crops and healthy animals. Edgar did as she asked, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. This is what happens, Margaret continued, when a woman is valued by her husband, when she's treated as a partner rather than a convenience, when her opinions are sought and her contributions appreciated. She stepped closer to Edgar, and he actually backed away slightly. Cole has never made me feel that I should be grateful for scraps of attention. He's never suggested that my age makes me suitable only for the most basic functions of marriage. He sees me as a whole person, not just a solution to his domestic problems. But surely you must see the advantages of a more established arrangement, Edgar began. I have a business, a position in the community, and I have a husband who chose me, Margaret interrupted. Not because he was desperate or because his first choice fell through, but because he saw value in me when other people saw only problems. Cole spoke for the first time since Edgar's arrival. Thornton, I think it's time for you to leave. Now see here, this is between Margaret and myself. No, Cole said quietly. It isn't. Margaret is my wife. She made that choice freely, and she's made it clear she has no interest in changing her mind. Your business here is finished. Edgar looked back and forth between them, apparently searching for some sign that Margaret might be wavering. He found none. You're making a mistake, he said finally. You could have had security, respectability. I have security, Margaret said firmly. I have respectability, and I have something you never offered me, genuine affection and respect. Now please leave our property. After Edgar had gone, Margaret and Cole stood together on the porch, watching his retreating figure disappear down the road. Any regrets? Cole asked quietly. Margaret considered the question seriously. Edgar represented safety of a sort, the conventional path, the respectable choice. But respectability without respect was a hollow prize. None, she said firmly. Not a single one. The second test came in the form of gossip and social pressure. Word of Edgar's visit spread quickly through Cedar Ridge, as such news inevitably did in small towns. The story grew in the telling, becoming a tale of a woman who couldn't appreciate what she had, who was encouraging inappropriate attention from former suitors. Margaret first became aware of the gossip during her weekly trip to town. Conversations stopped when she entered shops and resumed in whispers after she passed. Mrs. Abernathy made pointed comments about women who stirred up trouble and encouraged improper advances. Some people, Mrs. Abernathy announced loudly enough for Margaret to hear, don't know how to conduct themselves with proper dignity once they're married. Margaret turned to face her directly. Are you referring to something specific, Mrs. Abernathy? The older woman flushed but held her ground. I'm simply saying that a married woman should discourage attention from other men, not encourage it. And what should I have done when Edgar Thornton appeared uninvited at my home, hidden in the barn until he went away? You could have refused to speak with him. I could have, Margaret agreed, but I chose to make my position clear so there would be no future misunderstandings. I told him directly that I was happy in my marriage and had no interest in his belated offer. How exactly does that constitute encouraging his attention? Mrs. Abernathy had no good answer for that, but her disapproval remained clear. The social pressure might have worn Margaret down in her younger years, when acceptance and approval seemed essential for survival. But marriage to Cole had given her something she'd never had before, unshakable confidence in her own worth. She no longer needed the town's approval to feel valuable. Still, the gossip bothered Cole more than it did her. Let me handle this, he said one evening after Margaret had recounted the day's encounters in town. A few words in the right ears, and this nonsense will stop. No, Margaret said firmly. Let them talk. Their opinions don't change the facts of our life or our marriage. But it bothers you. Less than you might think, Margaret said, surprising herself with the truth of it. I've spent most of my life trying to earn approval from people who were determined not to give it. I'm tired of caring what they think. Cole looked at her with something approaching admiration. You've gotten stronger. Or maybe I was always this strong, but never had reason to show it. The third and most serious test came in the form of genuine adversity. A late spring storm brought hail that destroyed much of their crop and scattered their cattle across miles of countryside. Cole spent days rounding up the animals, many of which were injured and needed nursing back to health. Margaret threw herself into the crisis with characteristic determination. She helped tend injured cattle, rationed their remaining supplies to make them last through the season, and took on additional work to bring in money while their farm recovered. "We could go to the bank," Cole said one evening as they tallied their losses. "Take out a loan to get us through." "Or I could take in sewing again," Margaret countered. "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that several ladies in town are looking for a good seamstress." "I don't want you to have to work outside the home." "Why? Because it reflects poorly on you as a provider? Or because you think I'm too good for that kind of work?" Cole paused, considering the question honestly. "Because I've seen how happy you've been just being my wife and managing our household. I don't want you to have to go back to working for other people." Margaret felt a warm glow at his concern, but her practical nature asserted itself. "Cole, I worked for other people for 20 years before I married you. It didn't diminish me then, and it won't diminish me now. Besides, we're partners. When times are hard, partners pull together." So Margaret returned to sewing, but this time the work felt different. She wasn't laboring out of desperation or because she had no other choices. She was contributing to a shared goal, helping to rebuild something she'd helped create. The work was still tedious, but it was given meaning by its purpose. The women who brought her their sewing projects were often the same ones who gossiped about her marriage. But Margaret found she could face their veiled criticism with equanimity. Let them whisper about her unconventional wedding or her husband's questionable judgment. She knew the truth of her marriage, knew the strength of the partnership she and Cole had built. By fall, they'd not only recovered from the storm damage, but had improved their situation. Cole's patient work with the injured cattle had paid off. Most had recovered completely, and his reputation for animal husbandry had brought additional business from neighboring ranchers. Margaret's sewing had provided steady income and had reestablished her reputation as the finest seamstress in the county. "We make a good team," Cole said one evening, as they reviewed their finances and found them better than they'd been since before the storm. "We do," Margaret agreed. "I've never had a partner before. I didn't know how much difference it would make." Their trials had done more than test their marriage. They'd strengthened it. They'd learned they could depend on each other, that their individual strengths complemented rather than competed. They discovered that the respect and affection they felt for each other could deepen under pressure rather than cracking. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars appear in the clear autumn sky, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that humiliating morning on the church steps. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Edgar hadn't changed his mind?" she asked Cole. "No," Cole said simply. "I don't waste time thinking about roads not taken. I do sometimes. Wonder if I would have gone through with marrying him, if I would have spent the rest of my life settling for someone who saw me as adequate rather than valuable." Cole reached over and took her hand. "But you didn't. You chose better. We both did." Margaret squeezed his fingers, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "Yes, we did." 2 years after their unconventional wedding, Margaret Brennan stood in the same spot where she'd first seen Cole's ranch. But everything had changed. The house had been expanded with a new parlor and a larger kitchen. The garden had tripled in size and now included fruit trees that were just beginning to bear. The pastures held twice as many cattle as when she'd arrived, and the barn had been rebuilt to accommodate their growing success. But the most dramatic change was in Margaret herself. The woman who had once shrunk from public attention now carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own worth. Her hair, now more silver than auburn, was styled in a way that emphasized rather than hid her age. Her clothes were well made and well fitted, speaking of prosperity rather than penny pinching. Most importantly, her eyes held a contentment that had never been there before. Cole emerged from the barn, as he did every evening at this time, and Margaret felt the familiar flutter of pleasure at seeing him. What had begun as respect and affection had deepened over the months into something she finally felt safe calling love. Not the desperate, clinging emotion she'd imagined in her youth, but something steady and sustaining and real. Good day? Cole asked, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built the previous summer. Very good. Mrs. Henderson finally paid her sewing bill, and I got a letter from Sarah about our order for winter supplies. Sarah was Cole's sister, who lived in Denver and served as their connection to suppliers for goods they couldn't produce on the ranch. Over the months, Margaret had developed a warm correspondence with the woman she'd never met, but who had welcomed her into the family without reservation. And you? How are the new calves? Thriving. That bull we bought from the Morrison Ranch was worth every penny. Cole leaned back in the swing, his shoulder brushing against hers. I've been thinking about expanding again, maybe adding some sheep. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The wool market is strong right now, and I could use the wool for my own spinning. This was how they made decisions now, together considering both practical and personal factors, weighing options until they found solutions that served both their individual interests and their shared goals. Margaret, Cole said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, there's something I want to talk to you about. Margaret felt a flutter of concern. In 2 years of marriage, Cole had never sounded quite this formal. What is it? It's about us, about our marriage. The flutter became a chill. Had he grown tired of their quiet partnership? Had he begun to regret choosing a woman who couldn't give him children, who brought no family connections or significant dowry to their union? I see, she said carefully. What about our marriage? Cole turned to face her directly, taking her hands in his. I want you to know that what we have, it's not what I expected when I stepped forward that day at the church. Margaret's stomach dropped. I understand. If you've changed your mind about what you want... Margaret, stop. Cole's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not saying I'm disappointed. I'm saying I've been surprised by how much more this has become than I thought possible. Margaret blinked, thrown off balance by the unexpected direction of the conversation. When I married you, Cole continued, I thought I was getting a partner. Someone to share the work and the quiet moments. Someone practical and intelligent who would make my life easier and more comfortable. And instead, Cole smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Instead, I got all of that and something I thought I was too old to find again. I got someone to love. The words hung in the evening air like a gift offered but not yet accepted. Margaret stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. Love? She whispered. Love, Cole confirmed. The real kind. The kind that grows stronger when it's tested, that makes everything better just by existing. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. I thought what we had was enough. Respect and affection and partnership. I thought love was something that happened to other people, younger people. So did I, Cole said, until I realized I was waking up every morning grateful that you were in my life, until I started looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day, until I began to understand that you hadn't just made my life better, you'd made me better. Margaret couldn't speak around the emotion clogging her throat. I love your intelligence, Cole continued. The way you think through problems and find solutions I never would have considered. I love your strength, the way you face challenges without complaining or giving up. I love your kindness, the way you treat everyone with dignity even when they don't deserve it. He paused, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. And I love the way you've grown into yourself since we've been married. You're more confident, more sure of your own worth. You've bloomed like a flower that finally found the right soil. Cole, Margaret managed to say, her voice thick with tears. I know it might seem strange, declaring love 2 years after we married. Most people do it the other way around. But I wanted you to know, I wanted you to understand that this isn't just a successful partnership anymore. It's not just practical or convenient or sensible. He leaned closer, his eyes holding hers. I love you, Margaret Brennan, completely and without reservation. And I wanted to know, do you think you might feel the same? Margaret looked at this man who had rescued her from humiliation, who had seen her worth when others saw only problems, who had patiently waited for her to bloom into the woman she was meant to be. She thought about the way her heart lifted when she heard his step on the porch, the way his opinion mattered more than anyone else's, the way she couldn't imagine her life without him in it. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. Yes, I love you too. I think I have for months, but I was afraid to name it. Afraid? Afraid it was too good to be true. Afraid that if I acknowledged how happy I was, something would happen to take it away. Cole pulled her closer until she was nestled against his side on the porch swing. Nothing's going to take this away, he said firmly. We built this together, and we'll protect it together. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Margaret marveled at how right this felt, how natural it was to love and be loved by this good man. Margaret, Cole said eventually, do you regret anything? Any of the choices that led you here? Margaret considered the question seriously. She thought about the broken engagement in her youth, the years of caring for her difficult mother, the humiliation on the church steps that had seemed like the end of hope. No, she said finally, I don't regret any of it. Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led me to you, led me to this life we've built together. She looked around at the prosperous ranch, at the comfortable home they'd created, at the man who had chosen to love her exactly as she was. Besides, she added with a smile, if I'd married young like most women, I would have missed this. I would have settled for someone who saw me as adequate instead of precious. I would never have known what it felt like to be truly valued. Cole tightened his arms around her. The best things are worth waiting for. Even when you have to wait until you're 45? Especially then, Cole said. By then, you know enough to recognize real value when you see it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been rejected, humiliated, written off as too old and too late. But all of that had been necessary to bring her to this porch, this man, this love that was deeper and stronger than anything she could have imagined in her youth. Cole, she said softly. Yes? Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for choosing me when no one else would, for loving me when I thought love was impossible. Cole kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. Thank you for being worth seeing, worth choosing, worth loving. Under the vast western sky, with the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them, Margaret Brennan finally understood that some stories don't begin until the rest of the world thinks they're over. Some love doesn't bloom until the ground has been prepared by experience, wisdom, and the kind of strength that only comes from surviving life's disappointments with grace intact. She was 47 years old and her real life was just beginning. And that, dear viewers, is the story of Margaret Wilson, the woman who was told she was too old for love, but discovered that the best kind of love often comes to those who've learned to wait with dignity. Margaret's story reminds us that worth isn't measured by age, that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that sometimes what seems like an ending is actually the beginning of something beautiful. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever felt overlooked or undervalued because of your age? Have you experienced the joy of being truly seen and appreciated for who you are? Share your thoughts, your experiences, your own stories of second chances and unexpected love. And if you believe, like I do, that everyone deserves to be valued for their true worth, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear Margaret's message today. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, redemption, and love on the American frontier. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of strong women and the men wise enough to appreciate them. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to write a new chapter, to find love, or to discover that your greatest adventures might still be ahead of you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the frontier.